Have you ever said yes while every cell in your body was screaming no? Do you feel loved or just tolerated when you're being good? What if being the good girl is the most dangerous thing you've ever been taught? In a world that rewards obedience over authenticity, one archetype continues to thrive in silence: the good girl. She smiles when she's hurting. She gives when she's empty. She's praised, admired, sometimes even envied. But inside, she's cracking. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." And for many women, that burden begins with being told to be nice, quiet, and pleasing to everyone but themselves. This video is not about rebellion, it's about liberation, because behind the mask of the good girl lives a forgotten force, a repressed truth, a shadow. And until that shadow is faced, it will silently sabotage every relationship, every choice, and every attempt at self-love. This journey begins where most self-help ends, not in fixing yourself, but in facing yourself. You'll see how the good girl archetype is born, why it's reinforced by family systems and culture, and most importantly, how it's not just a personality trait, but a psychological defense that's keeping you from your true self. Throughout this exploration, we'll use Jung's map of the psyche, the persona, the shadow, and the path toward individuation to unravel the myth of being good. We'll meet the invisible wounds hidden behind smiles, the rage buried beneath politeness, and the soul that's still waiting to be real. So, if you've ever felt trapped in your own kindness, if you've been praised for being easy to love while secretly dying inside, stay, because this is where the mask comes off, not in anger, but in truth. And truth, as Jung taught us, is not always gentle, but it is always healing. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Let's begin. The mask of the good girl, where it all begins. She was praised for being quiet, for being polite, for never making a scene. Long before she had language to describe her needs, she had already learned the rule: be good or be rejected. The good girl doesn't arrive by accident. She's shaped, carved carefully by culture, family, and fear. And beneath the surface of her pleasantness is a survival strategy as old as the psyche itself. In Jungian terms, this is the formation of the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. The persona is not evil, it helps us belong, but when it becomes fused with identity, the individual forgets who she is beneath the performance. From early childhood, she notices anger gets punished, boundaries are labeled selfish, and sadness is inconvenient. But smiling, being helpful, being agreeable, that earns love, or at least what looks like it. So, she adapts. She learns to anticipate the needs of others before her own. She becomes hyper-aware of tone shifts, eye rolls, or subtle disapproval. She masters the art of shrinking her desires just enough to stay acceptable, but not so much that she disappears completely, although she often does. And where does this begin? The mother. Not necessarily the biological mother, but the maternal imprint, the first emotional authority. Whether overprotective, emotionally unavailable, or simply trapped in her own generational pain, the mother becomes the mirror through which the girl learns how to be loved. And in that mirror, she sees a condition: you are loved when you are easy to handle. This is the root of the good girl archetype. Love becomes performance. Connection becomes currency. Authenticity becomes a risk, and yet the world keeps applauding her. She's so sweet, so responsible. She never causes trouble. But no one asks what it costs her, because the world rarely notices the sacrifices of the good girl. It only celebrates the benefits she provides to others. Behind every compliant smile is a quiet calculation. If I say no, will they still love me? If I disagree, will I be abandoned? This is how a psychological mask becomes fused with the soul. She begins to believe that being liked is the same as being loved, that being chosen is more important than being known. But there is a deeper truth stirring beneath the mask. The parts of her she had to bury, the anger, the assertiveness, the rawness, they don't die. They descend into the unconscious. They become shadow, and that shadow doesn't stay silent forever. Jung warned us, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And for the good girl, this is the beginning of that terror and liberation. Because to truly awaken, she must return to the moment she first split herself in two, the version who pleased and the version who paid for it. If this resonates with you, subscribe now. This is just the beginning of uncovering the unconscious patterns shaping your life. The birth of the shadow, everything you repressed. The good girl smiles. But beneath that smile, something stirs, something raw, something unspoken, something dangerous. Or at least that's what she was told. This is where the shadow is born. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of the psyche that is unconscious, unseen, unwanted, unloved. It contains everything a person has disowned in order to be accepted. For the good girl, the shadow is full of things she was never allowed to be. Angry, powerful, rebellious, messy, desiring. Every time she bit her tongue, every time she stayed silent to keep the peace, every time she betrayed her own truth to protect someone else's comfort, she fed the shadow, and the shadow remembers. It remembers the moment she swallowed her no. It remembers the tears she hid, because good girls don't cry like that. It remembers the laughter she faked, the pleasure she denied, the rage she buried so deep it started to show up as anxiety, insomnia, and chronic guilt. Because the shadow doesn't just sit in silence, it whispers, in dreams, in triggers, in quiet resentment that builds like static beneath the skin. She starts to notice it in her relationships. She's always the one giving, accommodating, sacrificing. But deep down, she's angry, not because others take too much, but because she never learned how to take up space. That anger terrifies her, because she was taught that anger is ugly, selfish, unfeminine, dangerous. So what does she do? She turns it inward, into self-criticism, into perfectionism, into a voice that says, "You're still not enough." This is the cost of exile. When a part of the self is disowned, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. The buried desire to speak up becomes people-pleasing. The buried assertiveness becomes social anxiety. The buried sensuality becomes shame. And over time, the good girl becomes a ghost of herself. Polite, but disconnected. Reliable, but resentful. Adored, but never truly seen. This is not her fault. It's a psychological adaptation. She did what she had to do to be safe, emotionally, relationally, even physically. But safety is not the same as wholeness. Wholeness requires that she turn toward the shadow, not to judge it, but to integrate it, to reclaim what was once too dangerous to feel. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This darkness is not evil. It's full of life. It's full of the woman she could have been and still can be. But first, she must stop apologizing for her truth. She must learn to sit with discomfort without abandoning herself. She must recognize that the parts she hid are not shameful. They're sacred. The shadow is not the enemy. The silence is. And once she begins to speak from that place, not everyone will applaud. But finally, she'll hear the sound of her own soul. If this feels like the journey you've been waiting for, subscribe now. This channel is a space to explore the parts of you that no one taught you to love. Symptoms of the wounded good girl. She seems fine. She goes to work. She texts back. She remembers birthdays. She smiles in photos, but something inside her feels off. She's tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. She's surrounded by people, yet constantly alone. She gives love, but often feels unseen, untouched, unknown. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms, the silent cries of a psyche split in two. When the good girl represses her shadow long enough, the wound begins to show, not as chaos, but as quiet suffering. Because suffering in silence is what she was trained to do. She doesn't rage, she overfunctions, she doesn't collapse, she accommodates, she doesn't say, "This hurts." She says, "It's okay," even when it's not. Let's name the symptoms that echo through her life. 1. Chronic people-pleasing. She says yes when she means no. She cancels her needs for others' comfort. She tolerates bad behavior to avoid conflict, not because she's weak, but because her nervous system was wired to equate boundaries with rejection. 2. Invisible rage. She doesn't scream, she simmers. Resentment builds like a storm behind her ribs. She finds herself furious over small things, not because they matter, but because she's carrying years of unexpressed truth. Rage is a symptom of repressed voice, of never being allowed to say, "This is not okay." 3. Low-grade depression or emotional numbness. She should be happy, she has a good life, but she feels disconnected from others, from joy, from herself. This is the cost of emotional suppression. The more she denies what she really feels, the more life turns gray, because you cannot selectively numb emotions. When you bury rage, you also bury wonder. When you silence grief, you mute joy. 4. Relationship burnout. She gives everything, but still feels not enough. She's the caretaker, the peacemaker, the one who keeps the house warm, but her relationships often feel one-sided. Because the more she self-erases, the more others unconsciously expect her to stay erased. She may even feel guilt for needing anything at all, believing that to be loved, she must remain effortless. But love without effort is not intimacy. It's servitude. 5. Fear of being truly seen. She longs for connection. But when someone gets too close, she panics. Because being seen means being vulnerable, and for the wounded good girl, vulnerability is dangerous. It risks exposure. What if they see the mess? The jealousy, the rage, the selfishness. What if they don't love the whole of her? So she hides. Behind competence, behind calm, behind control. But the mask is heavy, and over time, it begins to crack. Jung once said, "Until you confront the shadow, you will project it onto others and call it fate." And that's what begins to happen. She attracts friends, partners, jobs that mirror her wounding, people who take more than they give, situations where her voice is lost again and again, not because she's cursed, but because the unconscious is asking her to wake up, to stop betraying herself, to stop earning love through sacrifice. Her body knows, her dreams know, her loneliness knows. The question is, will she listen? Because symptoms are not failures, they are messages. And when she finally decodes them, the healing begins. If this reflection speaks to you, subscribe. This space is here to remind you, you're not broken, you're awakening. The psychological danger of being too good. On the outside, she's everything society applauds. She's generous, she's kind, she's emotionally available, she never causes problems. But underneath, she's exhausted, disconnected, and quietly breaking. Because no one told her that being too good can be deadly, not in the literal sense, but in the psychological, spiritual sense. The death of the authentic self. Jung didn't romanticize goodness. He understood its shadow. In his work, he warned that extreme virtue can often be a cover, a compensation for repressed impulses that have nowhere else to go. In other words, the more she tries to be good, the more her psyche becomes imbalanced. She begins to live from her persona, the socially accepted version of herself, and disconnects from the messy, contradictory, very human core within. But what happens to the feelings that don't fit the good girl image? They don't vanish. They rot in silence. The hidden cost of being good. When a woman makes kindness her identity, saying no becomes a moral failure. She loses the right to her own limits. She becomes addicted to being needed, even when it drains her completely. This kind of emotional overfunctioning can lead to emotional burnout, psychosomatic illnesses, depression masked as overachievement, and even worse, resentment disguised as virtue. She's praised for being there for everyone, but secretly, she's furious that no one is there for her, not because others are cruel, but because she never allowed herself to be visible in her full complexity. This is where goodness becomes dangerous, when it's not rooted in choice, but in fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of disapproval, fear of being called selfish, difficult, or too much. She shrinks but calls it maturity. She withholds her truth but calls it peacekeeping. She disappears and calls it love, but it's not love, it's erasure. The illusion of moral superiority. Sometimes the good girl archetype comes with an unconscious sense of moral pride. She believes she's better because she sacrifices more, because she suffers quietly, because she gives endlessly. This superiority is a defense. It protects her from admitting what she's denied, that she's angry, that she wants, that she resents, but denying the shadow doesn't make it disappear. It just leaks out through passive aggression, martyrdom, guilt-tripping, or emotional manipulation. In Jungian terms, this is shadow possession. When we don't own the darker parts of ourselves, they begin to act out unconsciously and often destructively. So ironically, the good girl, in her attempt to be kind and pure, becomes a source of confusion and pain for herself and others. The collapse. Eventually, something breaks, a betrayal, a burnout, a breakdown, and she can't do it anymore. She can't keep smiling when her soul is weeping. She can't keep agreeing when her gut says no. She can't keep giving when she feels invisible. This is the moment of psychological rupture and also the threshold of rebirth. Because what breaks is not the self. What breaks is the mask, and behind it is someone real, someone messy, someone whole. Jung believed that wholeness, not perfection, is the true goal of the psyche, and that means integrating both the light and the dark. The good girl was never meant to be destroyed. She was meant to evolve, to grow teeth, to find her voice, to choose love, not perform it. Only then can she step out of danger and into authenticity, integrating the shadow, the Jungian path to freedom. She doesn't want to destroy who she was. She just wants to stop pretending. This is the beginning of shadow integration, the sacred, often uncomfortable process of reclaiming the parts of herself she was taught to bury. Carl Jung didn't teach people how to be better. He taught them how to be whole. And wholeness requires honesty, the kind that rattles the cage of conditioning. Because to integrate the shadow is not just to understand it. It is to face it, feel it, and make room for it at the table of the self. Step 1. Radical self-observation. Integration begins in silence. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of witnessing. She begins to notice her patterns, the urge to say yes before thinking, the tension in her body when setting a boundary, the guilt that follows moments of self-assertion. She observes not with judgment, but with curiosity. Every reaction is a thread, and when followed, it leads back to an unmet need, a forgotten feeling, or a buried truth. This is not self-help. This is soul work. Step 2. Making conscious what was repressed. As she allows her truth to surface, the shadow begins to speak. It may appear first in dreams, images of fire, wild animals, unfamiliar voices. It may appear in projections, jealousy toward other women who express what she doesn't allow herself to. Or it may emerge in flashes of emotion, unexpected rage, fierce longing, deep sadness. Each one is not a failure. It is material for transformation. Jung wrote, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming." There can be no transformation of darkness into light, of apathy into movement, without emotion. She must feel what she once feared, and in feeling, she reclaims her right to exist as she is, not as she performs. Step 3. Rewriting the inner script. The good girl was built on a script: be nice, be small, be wanted. But the integrated woman writes her own lines: be real, be clear, be free. She learns to say no without guilt. I need without shame. I'm angry without apology. Not to become cruel, but to become whole. Because boundaries are not rejection, they are protection. Expression is not danger, it is truth. And reclaiming desire is not selfish, it is sacred. This is the movement from persona to authenticity, from performance to presence. Step 4. Living from the self. In Jungian psychology, the goal is not to be good, it is to live from the self, the unified center of the psyche where all opposites are held and honored. The self embraces contradiction. It welcomes both strength and softness. It allows her to be nurturing without self-abandonment, fierce without cruelty, loving without losing herself. She becomes not a role, but a force. And the world begins to feel her, not just her smile, but her energy. This is not easy. Some relationships may fall away, old identities may dissolve, but what emerges is real, alive, rooted in something deeper than approval. The journey of integration is the journey home, to the woman she was before she was told who she had to be. And once she meets herself there, fully, honestly, she is no longer trapped in the performance of being good. She becomes true. And there is no greater freedom than that. From pleasing to power, the return to wholeness. She was never broken, only trained to please, to perform, to be perfect. But now she knows. The good girl wasn't her truth. She was a mask, a beautiful, smiling defense built to protect a heart that never learned it was safe to be whole. This journey wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering the parts of herself she buried to be accepted. And now, she no longer seeks applause for her silence. She no longer trades her soul for safety. She no longer believes that love must be earned through self-erasure. She sees it clearly, the patterns, the pain, the persona, and behind them all, a woman is waking up. Not polished, not perfect, but real. Jung taught us that we find our true self not in the light, but in the union of opposites. Not by chasing purity, but by embracing contradiction. That's the difference between goodness and wholeness. Goodness asks you to behave. Wholeness asks you to belong to yourself. So she lets go of the need to be liked, of the fear of being too much, of the myth that worth is earned through obedience. In its place, she chooses something ancient and unshakable: truth, voice, power, presence. She is no longer the good girl. She is the integrated woman, rooted, clear, alive. And though some will resist her change, she no longer betrays herself to be digestible. She knows now. A soft no can be louder than a loud yes. Anger is not a flaw, it's a compass. Being seen is terrifying and worth it. She can be kind and still walk away. She can love and still protect her energy. Her shadow is no longer the enemy. It is her teacher, her mirror, her power. And in integrating it, she finds the freedom no praise ever gave her. The freedom to be whole, to be wild, to be deeply, unapologetically herself. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Carl Jung. This is not the end. This is the beginning. A life no longer lived for approval, but for truth. A self no longer shaped by fear, but by choice. A voice no longer silenced, but sacred. Welcome home.